Thank you all for being here today. This is a subject that is very personal for me. I taught cello for 21 years at UT Arlington, and I retired in 2012. And at that time, I actually went back to school to follow another passion of mine, which is learning more about dyslexia. My son was dyslexic, and I worked with him in a system that was designed for teaching dyslexic children, but I really wanted to know a lot more about it, and so I became certified. I am a certified academic language therapist. That is a little more formal term for a dyslexia therapist. So I am certified to work with dyslexic children and teach them how to read. So I want to talk about just briefly how I came to this point of bringing dyslexia therapy to music reading. And I had a student about a year ago who came in, and as a college professor, I rarely had students or met students who couldn't read music, because usually those kids that can't read are filtered out by college, or they're not going to major in music if they can't read music. So I never really had experienced that. And a student came into my studio who was in already mid-level intermediate to advanced intermediate repertoire, and he really could not read music. It was very haphazard. Sometimes he would know the name of a note, sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes he could recognize a rhythm, sometimes he couldn't. And the thing that was interesting to me is that I would go over it, I'd pull out my rhythm charts, and I'd talk about, relationships of dotted rhythms and this and that, and he would seem to understand it, but when I'd see him the next week, it was like he'd never seen it before. And I thought, well, I know that student. That's exactly who I work with when I work with dyslexic students. I've been practicing academic language therapy for 5 years now, so it's still actually new for me, but I've learned a lot about how these kids think and how we have to approach them in order to allow them to learn, to help them to learn. Once I had this student, I began talking with other teachers. Well, do you have this problem? And I talked with classroom teachers, and I really became curious about how prevalent the problem was. So I did a little survey, and I posted it on Facebook, and I got about 54 respondents. And I put the survey as your handout 1, and I gave you all the results, but I'm only going to talk about the first couple. Question 3, have you had students in your string program who did not or could not learn to read music within the context of standard instruction? And 98% said yes. Yeah, so I thought, oh, okay, and this is 53 out of 54 people responding. Have you had students drop out of your program because they could not read music? 50% said yes, and another 30% said they're not sure, but maybe, right? And then another question that I want to draw your attention to was, of the students who cannot read music, how common is it for them to have required accommodations or a diagnosed learning disability of some sort? And so 22% said it was very common to see this correlation between not being able to read music and having other learning issues. And 53% said it was somewhat common. So there wasn't always a correlation. And I think this is probably a very accurate representation of the world of the brain. All brains aren't the same, and they don't all present the same when we're looking at learning differences. So it's not clear-cut, but there's enough correlation that we can begin to look in other directions. So this term, dysmusia, was coined by Neil Gordon, a retired pediatric neurologist, to describe students who struggle learning to read music, and this is for reasons not completely understood. So the first obvious question is, are dyslexia and dysmusia related? And the answer is, we don't know. Maybe, but not necessarily. So they could be, or maybe not. So that doesn't help us a lot, does it? We know that there's overlap between learning language and learning to read music. There are aspects of those skills that are similar or the same, but there's also overlap between learning to read music and math. And dyscalculia is another learning difference that could impact a student's ability to read music. And that's going to have to do with perhaps more of the rhythmic aspect, or perception of distances is another issue that might not necessarily be about dyslexia, but just this brain that learns differently. So because there's a lot we don't know, we're going to start with things that we do know. We know that all brains aren't the same. Now, all normal brains are structured the same. They all have the same parts. But what is not the same is the way that the brain communicates within itself. And that's the issue we're going to be looking at and talking about today. So let's take the issue of handedness. And what percentage of our population do y'all think are left-handed? Yes? 10%, yes. And I've seen estimates up to maybe 12%. So it's in that range somewhere. And I ask you, do we call left-handedness a disorder? Yes. No. You know, a left-handed person thinks yes, but no. I mean, it never occurred to me to think of someone left-handed as being disordered or even abnormal, although they found out they land outside the statistical norm. But I would, you know, in my thinking, I wouldn't think, oh, that person's abnormal. No, they're left-handed. Their brain is wired differently, right? And it affects a lot of different areas in ways that are, some are understood and others that are not as understood. So we also know that left-handedness has a genetic component. And again, to what degree is being debated, but there is a genetic component. So if we compare this with dyslexia, what percentage of the population do you think is dyslexic? Any ideas?
Like 30?
Oh, wow, 30. No, that would be a lot. I think we would know a lot more about it if it were 30% of the population. It's 15 to 20%. 15, but compare that with 10% left-handed. You know, everybody knows people who are left-handed, right? Have them in your family. Well, whether you know it or not, everybody knows people who are dyslexic, too. About 1 in 5, and like handedness, dyslexia has a genetic component. So it runs in families. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at this handout on page 2, this beautiful color copy of brain wiring. The brain's many regions are connected by 100,000 miles of fibers. That's enough fiber to go around the planet 4 times in our white matter. That's what the white matter is. Okay, that's not extraordinary. In this photo, the pink and orange bundles are pathways that are associated with language. And I couldn't tell you whether that's spoken, I'm guessing spoken language. They didn't really specify it. So I think that's an amazing picture about what's actually going on in the brain. Now, spoken language is something that is hardwired. We don't have to be taught to speak. It's an evolutionary development. It's at least 150,000 years old, if not older. And children do not have to be taught to speak. They automatically begin babbling and imitating and experimenting with sounds, and they're listening, and they'll begin to form words after about a year, and this happens on its own. It's already built in our system that this will happen. Now, written language was only developed about 5,000 years ago, which is just a drop in the evolutionary bucket. This is a skill that is not hardwired, which means it has to be taught, which means the wiring has to be created or built, okay? Each individual brain has to be wired in a way that facilitates the ability to read. So to read, what does the brain have to do? The brain has to draw from various parts through this network to process information that is stimulated by the eye. For example, the eye would be stimulated by the letter S. We see a letter S, and that symbol has to be converted to an appropriate sound. And we have to know what are the possible sounds. In order to be able to associate that symbol with a sound, we have to know, well, what sound is it, or what sounds are there? We have to know what the possible sounds are, and we also have to know what impacts the decision about that sound. And I have a handout. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but it's handout 3. If you want to glance at it. This is about the letter S. And this is something that 80% of the human population intuits. In other words, they see an S and their brain kind of stores the sound and position, and all the information you see on this page happens through intuition, meaning that there are pathways in the brain that allow this information to be processed. Okay, so what impacts the letter S? It can make two sounds. It can say S or Z. And whether it says S or Z depends on where it is in the word. It depends what comes before, what kind of sound comes before it. It depends on whether there's a silent E after it. All of these things are going to impact that sound. And then there's the added complication of, well, I hear Z. Is it going to be S or is it going to be Z? Or I hear S. Is it going to be S or is it going to be C? So I didn't even add those possibilities in this list of things that have to be considered when you're learning to read the letter S, okay? Now, we're going to go back to our handout 2 and look at the diagram on the bottom. This was very enlightening for me as a parent of a dyslexic child. How a normal reading brain differs from a dyslexic brain. And you know what's extraordinary is that in the last 20 years or so, they've been able to do this brain imaging, and they can actually measure the electrical activity in the brain and see exactly what's happening when people read. So in a non-impaired brain, the Broca's area here is going to be the part that sounds out, makes that letter sound connection. And then these two parts in the back, the parietal temporal system and the occipital temporal system, are going to be responsible for processing all of the things we just saw on handout 3, like knowing all those conditions, knowing all those possibilities, and interpreting S the correct way. And then that information is going to get stored in this back area. That's the word form area. That's where the brain activates when you see a word and you immediately know what it is. You have that automatic response. So it's a system that requires communication, right? It's not all happening in one place. So then we look at a dyslexic brain, and what do we see? We're not seeing that activation, that processing. We're not seeing that storage. Guess what? It's not happening. It's not happening in a dyslexic brain. So what is happening is that dyslexic child is looking at the letter S, and they're sounding it out, and they might be able to get through a word, sit, and sit. And then they'll come back tomorrow, and guess what? They're going to have to start all over again, because there's no wiring to store the information. They're not storing it. And it's baffling if you don't know what it is and you see it from the outside. You don't understand why you did it yesterday, why can't you do it today, right? Now, some kids will have some wiring, but it'll be incomplete, which means half the time they're guessing, or they'll have wiring that takes them to the wrong conclusion, right? Because they're desperately grasping at ideas, trying to figure out how to make sense out of these letters they see on the page, like all their friends are doing, right? Okay, so music notation is only 1,000 years old, right? It's much newer than our written language. 1,000 years old, and the problem we have as music teachers is that dyslexia has been recognized and researched for over 100 years, really, because there is a universal literacy mandate in our society, especially today. All kids are expected to learn to read, right? And if they're not learning to read, we have to figure out why, because this is an expectation within our society. There is no universal mandate for learning to read music. If you can't learn to read music, okay, stop going to orchestra, quit band, you know. You don't have to, and no one will know, right? You move on with your life and you do other things. So there's nothing in place that says it's imperative that you learn this, and we have to understand why you can't. So this problem has not been researched, really. And the question is, what happens to the kids whose brains aren't readily wired for learning to read music, who don't have that wiring in place that allow them to make those connections? Well, they quit. So I'm going to talk about first what the problem is in our approach to teaching beginning, and I'm approaching this from beginning string classes, that would be problematic for these kids, okay? Basically, these instrumental string programs are taught from the perspective of how to play an instrument, not how to read music. Reading music is incidental. So, of course, it's logical to start with open strings. Every beginning teacher is going to start their kids with open strings. It makes perfect sense, right? But from a reading standpoint, you've got a note on the pitch on the third line for D, and you've got a pitch on the bottom line for G, and there's no connection between those notes, D and G. What D and G? What does that mean? Why is that called D and why is that called G? And I see 5 lines. Well, that almost looks like the 4 lines of my string. So why aren't those 2 notes next to each other like they're next to each other on my instrument? Right? If I think of those as strings, which is a logical, someone trying to understand and grasp information they can hold on to, they're going to make these kinds of connections. They're going to try to make sense out of it. And honestly, it doesn't make sense, except it's easier to teach open strings first, right? So from a reading standpoint, it only creates confusion. Another thing that we do in beginning string programs is we teach quarter notes first. And there's, again, perfectly good reasons for doing so, because it's easier to play with quarter notes, right? We have shorter bow strokes. More children's tunes, early songs can be played with quarter notes. You can do a lot more with quarter notes. But from a reading standpoint, it's like learning the alphabet starting with the letter M. You're starting in the middle. You're not starting from an end point and proceeding in one direction. And this is problematic for certain learners. This is problematic for a dyslexic brain. Most beginning string programs are heterogeneous classes, and they begin in the key of D major, which is, okay, you're already reading F sharp and C sharp. Sharp, what does that mean? Well, one of the kids I worked with, the just music kids I've worked with, said, well, it just means you use more fingers. She had no idea what it meant, and it made no sense to her. So there was no real understanding, right? It was just her brain trying to hold on to something. So one of the things One of the things I do when I first work with these kids is I show them a 3-octave scale, and to the grand staff, and I point to the first note and I say, this is the note A in bass clef, and can you touch and name the notes for me through the 3 octaves? And not one of them knew that if they started on A, they could just say the alphabet, because they were never taught that way. Or it might have been mentioned in passing, but it wasn't part of their basic understanding about how our notes are structured. So once I told them, I said, well, you can just start on A and say the alphabet to G and then start over again and do it again. And they go, oh, I can do that? Okay, I can do that. and immediately, they have success with that. They can do that. So academic language therapy, or dyslexia therapy, is the researched and proven solution for teaching dyslexic children how to read. It's like a miracle. It really, for parents who see their children blossom, and for me as an instructor to see how the children who come in believing they are not capable of learning, how they learn and how they can learn. So I have handout 4 is going to be a list of the components, the component parts adapted for the idea of teaching music reading. So the first aspect is that it's going to be a simultaneous multisensory approach. So anything that you're teaching, you're going to try to be teaching through multiple sensory pathways. And this will help build those neural pathways and facilitate learning. The teaching has to be systematic and cumulative. So the material has to be ordered in the natural order of musical language. I'm going to talk about what that is, beginning with the very easiest and progressing to subsequent elements. So the learning builds from the very, very simplest concept to the most complex, but never skipping steps along the way. The instruction has to be direct. The teacher has to be continually involved with the instruction. Practice is carefully supervised. This is important. We don't ever want kids practicing mistakes. So we don't ask them to practice on their own if they don't understand a concept. It's just not going to help them. A diagnostic teaching, when we're teaching, we teach to, and many of you are, of course, already aware of this, teach to the learning of the student. And you assess within each lesson what is going to happen in the next lesson. So it's a diagnostic approach. And then you're going to be approaching all skills from a synthetic and analytic perspective. So we're going to show how to bring the elements of musical notation together to form a whole. For example, you can bring a half note and 2 quarter notes together, and this makes a measure in 4/4. Or you can look at a measure of a half note and 2 quarter notes, and you can break it up into its component parts, right? So that would be the analytic aspect of teaching. So we want to make sure that all instruction incorporates these components in its approach. So as students are taught through multisensory, cumulative, explicit instruction, we are building those neural pathways that facilitate their learning. That's what we are doing. And there's graphic evidence of this in brain scans. After a year of academic language therapy, those parts of the brain that were lighting up in the normal reading brain are lighting up in the dyslexic brain, okay? So that information now is traveling, communicating with those other parts of the brain, and being stored. So now I'm going to talk to you about solutions. And these are just, this is an introduction to some of the ideas I've come up with in how to approach these students. So it begins with helping them understand their brain, right? I show them a picture of that brain with all the wiring, and I say, this is what a brain looks like when it's working. But not everybody has all the wires they need. Not everybody does. And what we're going to do here is going to build that wiring system. And it gives them a perspective, and it gives them hope, okay? Which these kids usually have very low self-esteem. They're embarrassed, ashamed, and they feel stupid because they can't do what everybody else in the classroom can do. And they don't know why, and they don't understand why. It's not easy. So we use discovery learning. I introduce students to the history of music notation. Before we ever talk about learning about music, I show them how it developed. And we look at old music notation, and I say, what do you see here that looks familiar? Is there anything that looks familiar? Well, maybe that kind of looks like a note, and well, this one has 4 lines, but I think my music has 5 lines, but this one has 4 lines, so it's kind of the same, but it's a little bit different. And what this does is it gets them thinking and observing. It gets them engaged in the process of understanding what they're looking at. I have a guided discovery exercise that, again, before I ever teach them anything about reading music, I brought this is a real page from a real student, and I play notes on the keyboard, very high pitch and very low pitch, and I say, if you hear a pitch that's up here, it's really high, put it on the upper part of the page somewhere. And there's no rules except that they have to just try to put it in the right high or low. And then if you hear something that's low, put it in the low part. And then if I play some notes that you're not sure if they're high or low, you could kind of put them in the middle somewhere. So so we do this, and it gives me an opportunity to see if they're differentiating high and low, which they all so far have been able to do, but it is a piece of information. I tell them approximately what size to make the little bubbles or balloons. Okay, we don't call them notes. So they do that for me, and then I bring this out and I put it over the page, and I say, look what you just did. You just created your own staff. You took those pitches, and we were able to place a grid over that, and if we wanted to go back and find that pitch again, we would have a way to measure distances and figure out where things are. But that's a lot of lines, and if we wanted to figure out which space this note here, this pitch was here in the middle, I'd have to kind of count up a lot of spaces and lines. So let's make it a little simpler, and let's add this one. So I cut it down to 11 lines, and I say, well, you know, mostly the notes that you and your friends are going to be playing in orchestra are just going to be these notes in the middle. So we could just narrow it down to these lines for the time being. But it's still kind of tricky because 11 lines in a row, it's still hard to count and figure out exactly which space that note in the middle is on. So then we take away one more. And this is that discovery process. They're learning by observing and seeing the process, okay? And I say, well, you know, we know there's supposed to be a line in there, but it's missing right now, and that helps us see the other lines more clearly. And we'll talk about later how we're going to add that back in and what we're going to do with that, but that's a conversation for a later time, because at this point, we're not going to be talking about ledger lines, all right? For the earliest parts of instruction, we're going to stay in the appropriate staff of the instrument that the student is learning. In all instruction, all terms have to be graphically described and explained and repeated and reviewed. All terms, pitch, note, measure, any term that I use, I have to explain what that means. I can't assume that they know, because they may have heard that word 100 times, but to them it means a planet in another solar system. I mean, I don't know what kind of connections their brain has been trying to make. So I have to make sure that everything is clear so that we are using the same vocabulary to the same purpose. When I introduce pitches, and I already referred to this a little bit earlier, I always start with A. We start with something that they know. They know the alphabet. This is something they can build their learning on. So we start with A. We talk about, well, first of all, we hear what it sounds like. I might play it on the keyboard in the appropriate octave. And then I say, let's talk about where that is. Well, let's put numbers for our lines and numbers for our spaces so you can tell me which number line it is or which number space. So they might say, oh, that's in space 1. And so we kind of talk about, well, does it fill the whole space? Well, yeah, it does. It's kind of a circle, and it touches each line, but it doesn't go above or below the line. So we talk exactly about what it looks, what they're observing. And then we pull out a blank staff, and I say, okay, now you get to draw one. And they have to be able to realize it from now their head, from their imagination. And if they're not sure, if they can't do it without looking, we look, and we allow them to look as many times as they need to look until it's coming from inside them. And each subsequent pitch is going to be introduced the same way. When we teach rhythms, We begin with the whole note. We don't begin in the middle of the alphabet. We begin with the whole note. And there are several good reasons to do this. The whole note is at the end of the spectrum. So any learning that proceeds from the whole note proceeds in one direction. They can build on that, right? The other thing about the whole note from a graphic standpoint is that it's the only note without a stem. And stems and hollow notes and filled notes are very confusing for our students. So we have to teach one concept at a time, and we start with the simplest one. This is the note that looks different from every other note. And then it's the note that we will begin to add things onto as we move into other durations. Another thing that's tricky for our dyslexic students is the idea that we see a musical a line, and we'll see a whole note. We might be able to identify it as a whole note, but there's space on this side and there's space on this side. And the truth of the matter is the whole note actually exists within the entirety of the measure. And it's very helpful for them to experience this idea. I've created this little graphic, and it has raised lines here, and when I first teach them this concept, I teach them that a whole note contains 4 pulses or beats or ticks. We call it a lot of different things, and we turn the metronome on and we just count 1, 2, 3, 4 off, or 1, 2, 3, 4 off. And we always go to off. We always take the note to the end, which many kids don't do, because they think when they get to 4 they're done. Right? There's 4 beats? Okay, I got to 4. The note's over. No, it's not. The note has to continue all the way to the next measure. All right? So finding ways to help them feel and experience and see it. And then when we go to half notes, let's see if I can get this the right direction here, then half notes are actually contained within a whole note. We can see that a whole note has the equivalent of 2 half notes inside of it, right? They're half the size, half the time. And then I have a similar one for quarter notes. So I pull these out with the introduction every time I'm introducing. Oh, there we go. Which way did those lines go? There we go. So quarter note, same thing. 4 fit inside a whole note, okay? After I introduce the whole note, I have to introduce the absence of sound, the concept of absence of sound and a whole rest. And I go through the same process with a whole rest that I do with a whole note. Involve talking about it, describing it, putting words to it, getting a staff, practicing drawing it. And then the very first music they will read is a whole note, measure of whole note, a measure of rest, whole rest, and a measure of whole note. That will be the very first note reading experience, successful note reading experience that they will have. And it's, of course, just the beginning, but it's the simplest part of this system. So each new skill that's taught thereafter is integrated in a very structured way. A student is never asked to attempt a new skill that hasn't been taught very explicitly. We don't teach a new skill until previous skills achieve a particular level of mastery. If there's any confusion, we don't want to add something onto it. We don't. We just wait. We just practice it more. We just practice it until it's integrated into their understanding. So what we're aiming for with any concept that we teach is automaticity. The ability for that student to see a whole note, to be able to look at it and say, oh, whole note, 4 beats. I know that, right? Without any hesitation, without having to think about it. That's our goal. So in working on developing an approach, you could turn to handout 5. And I kind of divided up into levels, trying to think what the most simple things are necessary to learn first before building into more complex skills. And these are the things that I came up with. So teaching the first 7 pitches in alphabetical order. So they shouldn't be doing anything until they can identify 7 notes with the pitches A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There's no point in going to other pitches if they can't do that first, right? I have them practice and name 3 octaves ascending, and also 1 octave ascending and descending. And I have the names of the notes written underneath. So until they've learned all the notes and can begin to do it automatically, they're just getting prompts and help. You can see the order that I'm teaching: duration, whole note, and whole rest first, and then go to the half note, then the quarter note. I teach the time signature 4/4, but I don't teach what the bottom 4 means until they are comfortable with quarter notes. So I just cross it out, say, that's later. We're just going to, but every time we look at a new line of music, up until that point, we look at the top note and I say, what does that mean? What does that tell us? There are going to be 4 notes in the measure. Let's count. Do we see 4 notes in the measure? Yes, we do. Okay. And we review that over and over again, and again, until it becomes something that they are intuiting automatically. So ledger lines have to be introduced for violins within that first octave. So they're going to be introduced to it a little bit sooner than a cellist would be. It's just not necessary. So you don't do it until it's necessary. And then you see that we don't begin to talk about keys until 7 pitches are known, and until you can start looking at a keyboard and looking at half steps and whole steps and understanding what that means. Right, so bringing in this idea of altering pitches and having a pattern that we have to adhere to in order to be in a particular key. Okay, so this is a much more complex approach, and we have to lay the groundwork before they're going to have the capacity to understand that. I'm right on schedule. I'm leaving time for questions. So handout 6 is a sample lesson structure. And so the parts of a lesson, we're going to always start by reviewing the names of the notes, just touching them and naming, picking out where they are on the staff and associating that name with the note. And then we have flashcards, and all the information that we've learned so far we put onto flashcards and review every session. They have to be able to see a half note and say that is called a half note and it is valued at 2 beats, okay? And that is a whole note and that has 4 beats. And that is a half rest and that is equal to 2 beats. And they have to be able to identify this again automatically. We use the flashcards to help develop automaticity. I do in the notes, when they've only learned 3 or 4 notes, I'll go through the flashcards several times because it's very quick. But each time through, it's faster, right? They're reinforcing it, and it's getting easier. Then we'll have, so that's the review session, and then you'll have a part of the lesson plan where you might be introducing a new note or a new duration or a new idea, new concept. But not all sessions are going to have new information introduced. Then the reading portion, and you will read simple lines that have been constructed that just contain the information that they have been taught so far, right? So the learned pitches and can be a variety of patterns. The more they review them, the better. And then learned durations, so a line of half notes, whole notes, and half rests. And then by the time they get to quarter notes, we start with just quarter notes and quarter rests, and then we'll begin to add in quarter notes and quarter rests and half notes. And so we gradually take the elements that they have learned so far and we begin to build them together. And then at the very simplest letter, we take pitch and we take rhythm and we begin to put those together, right? But that's going to lag behind a little bit because we want to make that pitch reading automatic and we want to make that rhythm reading automatic before we try to put the two together, okay? Because that's their brains really having to stretch to encompass both of that information at the same time. And then the dictation aspect, and that's not saying, okay, what's this note, but saying I'm playing an A and now I'm playing a C. Could you write these two notes for me? A, C. So they're being able to draw from their memory, where is that note, what's it look like, and how do I draw it, right? So I tell them the name, and I play it to give the audio training, but they're not going to be able to use that information as much as just, can I see where that note is in my brain and recreate it on the page. And then rhythmic dictation, which they really enjoy. I think it's a little easier. Singing a measure, starting out with one measure of maybe sing a half note and 2 quarter notes. And sometimes they'll have me do it 4 or 5 times, before they're ready to attempt writing it down. But I do it as many times as they need, and then I do it when they're ready, when they're ready to write that down, and it's very exciting because they can do it, and then they can sing for me and dictate to me. And in order to do that, they have to come up with a rhythm in their head and know what it looks like to be able to do that for me. And again, it could be something very simple, just a half note and 2 quarter notes. It doesn't have to be complex. It's the understanding of how it works and the approach and being able to work with these smallest building blocks and play with them, that's going to be the foundation for their understanding as we begin to add new concepts and materials. So I think that's the body of content. I think in closing I want to say this. Just like dyslexia therapy does not interface with classroom teaching in reading, approaching music reading for these children is not going to interface with your classroom instruction at first. It just won't. It can't, because our kids can't learn it that way, right? But what does happen, once we get through level 1 and the very beginning of level 2, where they're beginning to be introduced to chromatic alteration, they're going to be able to join the kids in the class, and they're going to have so much understanding about what they know. They're going to know much more than most of the other kids. They're not going to just know it, they're going to understand it. And the understanding is the foundation that allows them the continuous process of learning as they're exposed to more and more complex information and skills. So that is my presentation, and at this point, if anyone has questions, yes?
Are the lessons that you just described to us being taught away from the instrument?
I usually do, well, the first couple of lessons are done without the instrument, definitely. And then we slowly bring the instrument in. Once they're able to identify a note and count a whole note and sing a whole note, once they can sing, then we'll bring the instrument out and say, okay, now let's do this on the instrument. But we have to go through the process where they can do everything verbally first before we bring the instrument in. And with kids who have, who are in week 7 or 8, we're using the instrument for part of every session, but not the entire session. Yeah?
Is there less dysmnesia with piano since it's more visually logical than like a cello fingerboard?
Well, I think it's in... it exists. It might just be more approachable on piano. So yeah, I think, when I was researching literature, it seems that mostly it's pianists that are talking about this, actually. And I think that there are a couple of reasons for that. One is because piano is a one-on-one endeavor. So they're not having to deal with this, teaching to the group, right? Which works against our kids. They're the ones that are going to flounder. So they're always teaching to the, just directly to the student. They have that ability to do that. But I don't know, the idea of teaching chords, and I honestly, I don't know how to touch that. I don't know how to, and I'm not a pianist, so if I were, I might have a better clue as to how to organize that in the brain. But I honestly can't speak to it, so it's a good question, though. Yes?
So a lot of times when you're teaching in the classroom, you don't see your IEPs necessarily either school starts or a couple days before. And at that point, you may or may not have already like started teaching strings. So by the time you realize a student may be dyslexic or a student may have any other learning disability, you have already begun. So would you approach it as like a class endeavor, like everybody, let's work through this together and it helps multiple people understand, or do you pull out students for remediation, or what kind of situation would make it work in a group classroom setting?
That's a great question, and that is the big problem is how to approach it. If the group will benefit, why not? You know, I mean, I think that's awesome if you can devise an approach that everybody can learn from. The problem with these music students is that they probably need more time, more repetition, and the other kids, you know, if they intuit quickly, they might get bored. You know, it's so remediation, pulling them out, is ultimately probably the better solution. And you don't have to pull them out of class completely. I mean, they can still stay in class. They get by, right? They're watching their neighbor. They're looking at their fingerings. They're playing by ear. They're great at coping, right? But if after school once a week, or ideally twice a week, it would move more quickly for them if it was twice a week. You could give them that individual time with this kind of a structure. That would probably be best for the student. Yes?
So, on a staff, you know, when you go up, it gets higher. When you go down, it gets lower. But there's a student on the cello where, you know, if you go down,
Yes.
it's higher. But if you go up, it's lower.
I
Is there
know.
a way that you can?
Not just cello.
But yeah, I guess hold for violin. Really, I don't know. Is there a
Boy,
way?
that's such a good question, and I have a student that struggles with that. I don't have the answer for you right now. I'm going to have to think about it, but maybe I could talk to you afterwards. So, does anybody else have?
The way I address that is that you have to count your fingers. Your fourth finger is higher in the numbers. Your first finger is lower in the numbers. So count your fingers. That's how you go higher.
There you go.
Not
There, I
physically
knew there would be
higher,
a
but
solution
count
in the
your
room.
fingers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would maybe like, maybe not forever, but like while they're learning the pitches and everything, just turn over the staff and be like, this is going to be upside down for right now, but it'll make more sense this way. So yeah, just flip the music on its head and say, this is still A, but now let's try it upside down.
Oh wow. Yeah, I don't think you'd want to do that for a dyslexic student, but for a person that can reorient like that, sure, why not? Someone over here, yeah.
Are there any indicators when you see a beginner start to play that might kind of give you a flag to say, this might be a potential?
Yeah, if they're spending more time watching their neighbors than they are with their looking at the music, that's the biggest sign. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it would behoove teachers to have little assessments, you know, from time. I mean, it can be, you know, one question at the end of the week, you know, but just to assess who's absorbing, who understands, and who's not absorbing and understanding too. And I don't know what that would look like. And I've already talked with, at one of the schools where I'm working with some students, talked with the teacher about creating a kind of an assessment so that we could offer that as a tool, you know, for teachers. But yeah,
Can I just add to that? I have one student that I just always wonder about because she's always playing on the wrong string. She's got the fingers down, but she can't play. She can never make the connection between being on the right string. And I just wonder if that's part of it, or if that's
it can, yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't look one way. I mean, that's the thing. So it's cross wirings, and sometimes we have to really simplify and just get them on one string, staying on one string, and not going to other strings, you know, until we can overcome that particular deficiency, you know. Yeah.
Do you think that dyslexia and dysmusia are always connected, or can you have one or the other? And then does work with music seem to help kids' dyslexia?
question. Yes, that working with music helps kids with phonemic awareness, and phonemic awareness is being able to connect sounds and symbols or hear sounds. So music itself does enhance dyslexic children's learning, according to research. What was the first question?
Is it always?
Oh, no, there is no one-to-one correlation, no. Although from the survey, and that's why I did the survey, I just wanted to see what teachers are experiencing. And by the way, while I'm thinking of it, there is a survey on your last page. If you'd like to fill it out and leave it for me, I'd really appreciate it. I've changed a little bit of the wording, so there is, it's I think a Venn diagram, and there's like learning differences are in the middle, and this music is going to come out around it, and dyslexia, dyscalculia, this math, dysgraphia can also be a complicating factor. So yeah, just brains that aren't wired in a way that facilitates this learning. Yeah.
Do you also find that the kids that are experiencing this difficulty, they're kind of the jokesters in class, and they have, are there other indicators, social indicators to be looking at?
It plays out in all kinds of ways. More often than not, well, that or they're shutting down. They shut down, and because they want to hide. They don't want people to notice that they're not learning. Yeah.
This is the first time, I'll be honest, I've ever heard of dyslexia, so I'm like highly intrigued. But I didn't know. I'm trying to imagine what's your role. Like, for example, I know we have commonly speech therapists or reading specialists or anything of the sort at our schools, public schools. What would be? Is your role like? Are you doing this privately with students or
Who, me personally?
Yeah, or do you know if you? I don't know the extent to which kids are being treated. Or
Nobody's doing this, as far as I know. I mean, if you know of somebody, tell me. But I don't know of anybody that's doing this or has talked about it, which is why it hit me like such a ton of bricks when it occurred to me. So I'm doing it as a research project. I've worked with 4 kids now, taken them not completely through level 1. So I've kind of been designing this as I go along. What works, what doesn't work, what do they need? I volunteer. So far, I'm just doing it as a volunteer. I think, as teachers, if we can kind of restructure our thinking about how to approach these kids, we could help them. I'm toying with the idea of actually trying to create a little scripted program for teachers. I'm trying to discern if there's interest or need in something like that. How prevalent is the problem? If I spent the hours and hours and hours and hours and hours it was going to take to create this, would people actually use it? So I think it has to be someone who's trained in music. I don't think it can be a special ed person. I think they have to know and understand the language of music, right? So, but it could be a parent, a volunteer parent, or a volunteer from the community. It doesn't, or it could be a college student. It doesn't have to be the teacher itself. So, yeah, how are we doing for time? We're good. Yes.
I just wanted to say that this has been very emotional for me because I was never officially diagnosed with dyslexia, and I'm actually getting testing done in April for dyslexia.
Wow.
And I'm currently a sophomore viola performance major. So, but when I started on violin at the age of 5, I was in Suzuki all the way up until 5th grade, and I got up to minuet 1. I didn't make any progress at all. I didn't learn how to read notes, nothing. And so all of this is hitting me just in the face, this is me and this is what I went through. Then my teacher told me switch to viola. And then no, but seriously, that switch, I have to learn how to read in that clef. I couldn't scrape it by anymore. But now I'm realizing that when I still did learn to read the outer clef, I was learning, okay, this placement of this, on the staff, I associated that with my fingerboard.
Right.
And with the strings and things like that.
Right.
And all of those connections were made. But I will say that, since I'm just wow, this is me, I will say that as you know, a teacher, if you ever find a student that you're like, wow, this is something's interesting, something's different. Keeping the oral aspect of it is really important, and that is what I thrived off of, because like learning to play by ear really and things like that really helped when it came to, you know, when my teachers were like, you need to start learning more theory stuff. And then when I got to theory, that was just like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. So like, I'd love to like talk with you afterwards.
Absolutely, great. I'll be around. Yeah, we have a little bit more time left. Yeah.
Something that I've done to help students with multiple disabilities is color code by string. So like everything on the D string, I write finger numbers blue, everything on the A string pink, or whatever highlighters I need. And I've found that other students who don't have disabilities, like there's a week to go in the concert, like, can you color my music, please? I just need to get through. And I don't know if this would help.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think many teachers come up with tips and tricks to help these kids, because we're doing whatever we can, right? We're bending over backwards to try to help them. And what I'm talking about is something a little bit more fundamental, something that perhaps if someone had started with the whole note, you know, that would have assisted your ability to keep your ear and your reading more at, you know, the same level. And I agree that yes, keep them playing and play by ear, but ultimately, you know, in our world, to not be able to say, okay, let's go to C on the A string, and they're like, I don't know what C is, you know. I mean, it's hard to have a conversation. It's hard to communicate if you don't have a common language. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the common language, and also the thing that's going to give them independent learning skills, where they can take home a new piece of music and they can figure it out themselves instead of having to have someone play it for me or listen to a recording. And that's great if you can do that, but I think that's incomplete for the students that we're training, students who want to be part of an orchestra, right? Students that have to take auditions, students that have to be able to sight read in, you know, at UIL or whatever. Okay, wait, 2 more minutes. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious, because I don't know that much about learning disabilities, but this is purely for visual processing. It's not the students who have oral processing.
That's what I'm addressing, exactly.
Okay,
Yes.
just clarifying.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did, thank you. I wondered, I know that sometimes dyslexia affects the memory part of the brain. So how do you deal with
Well,
that?
that's what that picture is in handout. I mean, that's exactly what this picture is.
I know you did address it, but how, because I know they have to create the pathways, but I see everybody all at once
Right,
in a group setting, so it's
right.
challenging in a way
Incredibly challenging.
to have a bunch of kids who remember almost verbatim and then have somebody who,
Right.
I'll remind them, but.
Well, I mean, those are the kids we have to pull out at the end of class for 5 minutes, and you know, I mean, it's a remediation effort. A remediation issue, and I will say that, you know, with a dyslexic student, you can have the most dedicated, caring classroom teacher in the world. Dyslexic students must be taught through multisensory, explicit, cumulative instruction, academic language therapy. They're not going to learn it any other way. It's not the fault of the teacher. It's the way they have to learn to build those neural pathways, to have the memory, to create the memory, to create the storage. It takes time, takes repetition, and it takes that very, very structured approach to instruction. And it works. It works. I mean, it's a miracle. It works. Yes, last question.
Quick question. As a cellist, when you're teaching the A to the A and you're relating it then to the fingerboard, what are you doing with the mixed finger pattern then? If you're not going to use a sharp in your description of the alphabet, are you using the mixed finger pattern?
Well, they play B with the third finger on the G string, and they play F with the second finger on the D string.
So that's not confusing?
No.
Okay. I just didn't know.
No, it's not to them.
To them, that's not confusing.
No, because just what it is, you know?
That's why I was just curious.
Yeah, no, it just is what it is. I think we're out of time, but I'll stay here, so if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to. Thank you for coming. Oh,